all for being here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to them for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very excited to share some of my research with you, and more than that, I'm looking forward to get a chance to hear your thoughts on these ideas. What I'm going to present to you today are reflections about topics that I tackled in my book, The Past of Roman Anatolia, but not as fully as I would have wanted to, or not in ways that I found totally satisfactory. These are difficult topics about which I think there's a lot more to say, and I hope by engaging in dialogue with all of you, we can sort of think of ways to keep exploring these ideas. The painting on the screen illustrates the musical contest between the satyr Pan and the god Apollo, which took place in Lydia. That contest was attended by the Phrygian king Midas, who's recognizable here because of his donkey ears, and it was judged by the Lydian mountain Tmolus, Bozda. Cornelius Bishop, the artist, painted Tmolus here as a specter, not entirely abstract nor entirely anthropomorphic, a face petrified in what looks like a massive block of rock, or perhaps of amber, given the play of light and shadow. Whether he was successful or not, Bishop tried to take on ancient Anatolian myth history seriously, and I think for that he should be commended. More specifically, he tried to paint an Anatolian mountain person, a type of other than human being that obviously strained Dutch Golden Age painting conventions, but I think also strains modern archaeological theory and practice. I'll return to this talk to this painting at the end of my talk. But just to say in passing, the cover of my book also illustrates that very same contest between Apollo and Pan, even though it comes up with a very different solution to render the personified Tmolus. This painting was painted by, the watercolor was painted by Crawford Greenwald a few years before his death. At the core of my talk today is the issue of historical consciousness, or more specifically, the issues of varieties and divergences thereof. By historical consciousness, I mean very simply the historical information that people know, the narratives of the past that they maintain in consciousness, stories that can come from professional historiography, or from communal traditions, or from personal memory or imaginative speculation taken seriously. This is Charles Stewart's definition of historical consciousness. All right. There was a staggering variety of forms of historical consciousness in Roman Anatolia, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of those forms we know, they are recognizable, even if we don't practice them ourselves. Occasionally, one may feel that they are almost weirdly familiar, that today we engage in analogous endeavors to those undertaken 2 millennia ago in order to explain and explore the past. And yet other forms of historical consciousness, we are not well equipped at all to recognize, much less to investigate as archaeologists. In fact, archaeology is outright limiting. It's founded on principles that do not recognize, for example, the existence of such things as mountain people. Before I keep talking about mountain people, let me give you a roadmap of what we're going to do today. My talk is divided in 3 parts. I'm going to start with a brief discussion of the challenges of recognizing variety in historical consciousness, even when we have very explicit ancient sources attesting to such variety. I then treat the widespread phenomenon of engaging with the past in embodied ways, in ways that involve the entire body. These ways are cross-culturally common, yet not favored or even hazarded among many academic archaeologists. They're not the usual way we engage with the traces of the past. And I'll end with some reflections about what the evidence from Roman Anatolia can contribute to current discussions concerning the anthropology of history, as well as to what Anatolianists can gain from engaging in such discussions. All right. So first, for the issue of varieties. Roman Anatolia was a time and place full of what the intellectual historian Peter Miller has called past-loving creatures, this lovely turn of phrase, of men and women sort of turned with keen interest in the past. I've called these people archaeophiles in the book you see on screen, which Chidem mentioned, and Peter Miller actually discusses what the best term for these people is, and he debates the usefulness of archaeophiles and past-loving creatures in that second book, in Antiquarianism. I think some of this will be quite familiar with those of you who are interested in Roman Anatolia. People care deeply about, for example, local origins and kinship genealogies and such matters as intercity connections going back to really very remote antiquity. And the Anatolian epigraphic record is full of this stuff. A city such as Sardis could boast in public inscriptions that it was protoxenous, autochthonous, and somewhat extravagantly, mother city of Greece, and even more extravagantly, age mate of dawn. A tiny nearby town on the shores of the Gygaean Lake did similar things, celebrating connections to obscure Homeric heroes. The two inscriptions you see on screen have been published relatively recently, and they're the type of inscription from Sardis that engages with either this claim to really remote origins, protoxeny and autochthony and these things, or with really old Lydian history. So events that we would think happened in the 8th century BC. This inscription on the right mentions Sadiatis and the Heracleidae, and it's been treated with very in a very astute way by Peter Toneman. But this happens all over the place. As is well known, in the city of Aphrodisias, people celebrated Mesopotamian city founders, Ninos, Semiramis, and the Anatolian Gordes, in these reliefs that were erected in the civil basilica. And I guess what interests me, and now we're going to get a little bit more narrow, is that many of Anatolia's past-loving creatures, or archaeophiles, cared specifically about materiality, about the physical traces of the past. In the case of the Aphrodisians, this kind of improbable connection between their city and the first civilization's founders was ratified by the very tangible fact that the city's theater was built on a prehistoric mound, a mound of Semiramis, as Strabo and his contemporaries called what we now understand to be piles and piles of hundreds or thousands of years of human detritus. Apart from the theater, there were salient traces of early occupation scattered throughout the territory: fortresses, tumuli, tombs, inscriptions in what were, at the time of the Roman period, unknown scripts and languages. These remains that you see on screen, mattered because they substantiated historical claims. And the claims, in turn, were adduced in debates about historical precedents, but also social, religious, and even financial obligations, both among Anatolian cities and among those cities and Rome. So I guess for the next 10 or 20 minutes, I want to talk about who cared about the past and its material traces, And also, how did those who cared relate to the traces they considered meaningful? As to who cared about its material traces, the textual legacy of Roman Anatolia, both the epigraphic and the literary, provides semantic specificity to many of the endeavors of those archaeophiles. Evidently, I mean, there's no doubt that there were at least some people who cared in ways that modern historians of archaeology have found not only recognizable, but almost foreshadowing what would later be called antiquarian or archaeological endeavors. And I'm thinking about people like the traveler and historian Pausanias, who was from Lydia, who is arguably the paradigmatic example of one such archaeologist avant la lettre. But so too is the historian and geographer Strabo, also an Anatolian. And it's these people that scholars such as Bruce Trigger, the historian of archaeology, or Lance Schnapp, return to in their books about the origins of the discipline, the remote origins of the discipline. So Pausanias and Strabo are mentioned in the History of Archaeological Thought, and in all these three books, either written or edited by Schnapp, they are treated with respect and with kind of the recognition that these people were engaged in similar activities. But there were many others whose own writings survive only in very fragmentary form, and who, for that reason, have deserved almost no attention on the part of these intellectual historians. My own favorite of these people is the 1st century AD Roman historian, politician, and author called Gaius Licinius Mucianus. Mucianus traveled very widely throughout the Roman Empire and through Anatolia specifically. And from the very tiny fragments of his writings that survive, it is absolutely evident that this guy was a past living creature, an archaeophile. And if anybody wants like a short intro to Mucianus, one can do, like, it would be hard to do much better than with George Williamson's summary treatment that has, by the way, all of the fragments of Mucianus. So I'll talk briefly about his comments on Rhodes and on Ephesus and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. But I want to say that Mucianus fits sort of neatly into what the archaeologist and art historian Lothar von Falkenhausen defined as an antiquarian. Someone who, according to Falkenhausen, had a systematic preoccupation with the material remains of the past, who was motivated by an interest in the past as such, and who attempted to bridge a rupture in transmission. It's very easy to point to some of these examples of passages of Mucianus to show how intellectual historians find an antiquarian here. So, for example, he counted all the statues on the island of Rhodes. That sheer tallying, that kind of brute tallying, I think is recognizable as an antiquarian sort of maneuver. More interesting, I think, are other passages where his interest in the past and his interest in bridging ruptures in transmission are evident. This is a remarkable window into archaeophiles in the Roman East. Mucianus goes to the island of Rhodes. He goes to the temple of Athena at Lindos. He inspects the votive offerings there, and some of them he handles with his hands. In one case, he seems to have counted the separate threads that made the bigger threads in this strange breastplate of an Egyptian pharaoh that would have been many centuries old at the time when Mucianus inspected it. So he engages with it by touching it and comparing it actually to what Herodotus says of the same object. And closer to our place of interest in Ephesus, it seems to be the case that Mucianus goes to the temple of Artemis of Ephesus somehow inspects the beams of the temple, determines that they're cedar, and also is present in some sort of what now I think would be called conservation efforts, where some people in the temple pour nard oil onto the wooden statue of Artemis to keep it to keep it from decaying. A remarkable passage. So the question, who cared about the material remains of the past, is interesting and important because it tells you about, I think, what we could call the ecosystem or the ecology of antiquarians and past-loving creatures and archaeophiles. Who are the range of interpreters of these people? What are their social networks? Some of this work has already been done and has been done very carefully, and I think perhaps one of the sort of fundamental contributions is Christian Habicht's Seder lectures, Pausanias' Guide to Ancient Greece, where there are detailed passages trying to understand who's Pausanias talking to, and to a certain extent also Daniela Duke's work on Strabo is doing similar things. But there's a ton to be done. There's much more to be done, and I think I want to emphasize this. If one is interested in archaeophiles, there's still much more to understand about the social networks of these people. I'm gonna do very briefly, kind of return to the passages of Mucianus to point out how some of this can be extracted. When Mucianus went to Lindos and he inspects the breastplate of Amasis, the cuirass of Amasis, he says actually that it's in tatters because other people have been doing the same thing he has done, because other people have been touching the thing and thereby damaging it. So we're talking at least about two other sets of archaeophiles: the temple wardens who are taking care of this stuff, but also, I mean, I guess you could call them tourists, other pilgrims or visitors to the temple who, like Mucianus, want to touch the past and want to confirm or sort of prove false what Herodotus has said about an object such as that. In the other passage, there's even more stuff. Mucianus is evidently in debate and sort of competition with other experts like himself who had different ideas about the age of the temple or the material involved in the beams, or how the statue was or not as old as other statues. So you have other experts, you have temple wardens, and you have these interesting characters, these conservators, these people who know how to upkeep Xoanon, who know how to take care of a statue that is hundreds of years old and made of wood. There's more. I mean, we could go through every single passage of Mucianus, and in many of them you'll find other people interested in the past. This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but Mucianus apparently goes and visits somebody on Mount Tmolos in a place called the Heights, and this person is said to be 150 years old. And UNESCO until 1993 would have called this person a living human treasure. My point is simply that there's lots of ways to kind of read these passages to find, to shed light on the social networks. And of course, it's not just Mucianus, it's Strabo and Pausanias and all these other characters that we've been talking about. There are other experts archaeophiles. They're guides, professional guides. We know this from Pausanias. We know it from a Thermidorus of Daldis. We know it from inscriptions. There are obviously temple wardens. There are people in charge exclusively of the upkeep of texts, sort of archivists. There are also, and we'll hear more about this in a few minutes, the ritual experts, people who know how to harness the power of antiquities to make those antiquities do things. There are conservators. There's something that interests me a lot, and I think if people want to keep working on this, it's really virgin ground. Forgers. They're people who are making antiquities. Mucianus is pretty aware of this, but so too are many of the other archaeophiles that have been studying in Anatolia. There are people faking stuff, and there are people whose job is to detect the fakes. And perhaps also, most importantly, there's just a lot of people living by the traces of the past who have ideas about the traces of the past. Okay, let me do a little bit of a detour. Zainab Bahrani in Scramble for the Past has suggested that if we want to do fuller histories of modern histories of archaeology, fuller modern histories of archaeology, we need to figure out ways of bypassing the silencing of local or non-academic voices. She says that to do that, we have to read the text against the grain. That we could look at Claudius Rich's early observations on Babylon, or Austin Laird's text on Nineveh, and somehow extract local voices, non-academic voices, people who were engaged with that material, even though they were not the ones writing them. And I think very similar things can be done with many of the texts that mention interest in the past, that concern interest in the past, that those texts can be exploited to see a wide variety, the ecosystem of archiphiles, let's call it. And I want to make a caveat. This is not about flattening experience. I do not agree with my colleague Yanis Hamilakis. I do not think this is archaeology. I do not think there were archaeologists in the past. I do not think that the way to do this is by saying we're all archaeologists, they were archaeologists. I think what we need to do is try to understand those ecosystems in order to figure out why those people were interested and how they were interested in the traces of the past. Which brings me to my second question, which is how did those who care relate to the traces of the past they considered meaningful? Again, briefly, I've touched upon this in the book. The past was there to be experienced. Autopsy was important for many of these people, certainly for Mukianos, but also for many others. The past was there. The traces of the past had to be engaged with in unmediated fashion, in first-hand fashion, with the body. Those passages of Mukianos I read have to do with tactility and with olfaction. Mukianos wants to touch the linen threads. He wants to count them even. He's also interested in smelling the oil. This is not just attested in sort of a very elite antiquarian. It's all over the place. As some of you may know, the authentication of archaic Greek Corinthian bronzes apparently happened through the nose. There were experts who could smell the bronze and tell whether the bronze was actually Corinthian or not. Other experts did this type of thing by taste. Pliny says that he could taste differences in ancient plaster, in classical plaster. In his case, it had to do with the smell of saffron. But if we keep thinking about manners of engaging with the traces of the past, it is very easy to show the senses are key. Another passage I treat in my book in some detail is the notion, the claim that you could somehow hear the voice of Memnon in ancient Egypt. And that, as many of you know, visitors to these statues in Egyptian Thebes carved often poems, sometimes just graffiti, saying that they were there hearing the voices of time, as it were, voices as old as time. This, I think, these forms of embodied engagement pose serious problems for disciplinary historians and archaeologists. This is not about objectivity. And a lot of modern archaeology is founded on the notion that you can be objective, that you can be somehow erase yourself from the experience of engaging with the traces of the past. Embodied archaeophilia is about vividness, about immediacy, about immersiveness. And it is not simply an elite endeavor, although it can be an elite endeavor. It is not simply about somebody as powerful as a Roman consul or governor going about and saying, well, I want to touch that cuirass. It's happening all over the place. It was a community experience. For those of you who are interested in the topic, I've thought much about olfaction, specifically as it has to do with bringing communities of memory together, with bringing towns together to say, this is how we experience the past through smell. There's one example that I'm particularly interested in, a little town in Greece called Panopos, where part of the population says that they can smell the smell of the clay that was used by Prometheus to make the first man, and that they know it's that clay because it smells of flesh. This is a very sensorial engagement with a trace of the past in the present. So the question, how did past living creatures relate to traces they consider meaningful, has to do with strategies of engagement, with ways of knowing the past, and I think ultimately with varieties of historical consciousness. This is a realization that I slowly came about to this realization about the importance of embodied engagements and the importance of varieties of historical consciousness. And I think to a certain extent, when I wrote about Roman period engagement with Bronze and Iron Age rock cut reliefs and monuments, I wasn't fully aware of how central, how key the corporeal dimension of archaeophilia was. I knew things were happening, but I just as an archaeologist wasn't really attuned to the fact that what I should be thinking about was real bodies in those places engaged with rock cut reliefs and inscriptions and this sort of thing. An obvious example is the monolith of Fasilar that is now a copy of which is now in Ankara. That monolith is part of a complex assemblage of features that includes tombs, a Hittite quarry, Roman tombs, a little monument for a hero, and an inscription. But the important thing, in a way, is that this was a sort of stadium to hold communal athletic games in which people from different towns would come together, race, and also engage in a sort of mixed martial arts wrestling in front of that monolith, partly to strengthen bonds. When I was thinking about this, I really, when I first thought about it about 10 years ago, I really wasn't thinking about the importance of embodied experience, but I think it's key. And I think it's happening all over the place in the ways people in Roman Anatolia are engaging with the traces of the past. I think it's similar, for example, in the famous caves with mephitic gases along the Meander River in places like Hierapolis or Nyssa or Magnesia, where you have these ritual experts somehow engaging with powerful underground spaces that demand a certain gymnastic ability, the ability to control your breath in certain ways so as not to die. But it's happening also in places such as Magnesia, where there are rituals that involve, for example, young men supposedly uprooting trees, and you see them here carrying large trees, vividly described by Pausanias. They have to run along precipices with the trees on hand to ancient temples. These are very dynamic forms of engaging with the past. Now, let me give you a different example that seems, initially it may seem unrelated, and I think it's not unrelated, I think it's very important. Dance was a form of historical consciousness. There's a remarkable, there are two inscriptions from Mylassa that mention a Cretan embassy to Mylassa. And the ambassadors, what they did when they got to Mylassa was, when they got to Mylassa, they danced an ancient Mylassan dance. They danced a dance that was many hundreds of years old. That dance, the embodied performance, was meant to confirm the bonds between the two cities. This should make us ask all sorts of questions. How is it that people recognize a dance that is 500 years old or 800 years old? I mean, think about yourself. Would you be able to recognize a dance as ancestral? I mean, like a millennium old dance? There is, I think, as evidence in an example like this, community awareness of the importance of bodies in engaging with the past. And now a tiny detour, which I think is interesting, and maybe some of you know. The word archaeologist or archaeologos is attested in ancient sources. Strabo mentions it in the comparative. Somebody who's more skilled in antiquarian lore, archaeological. But the word by itself also exists in inscriptions, and it exists indeed in Aphrodisias. There's a graffito in the theater that mentions an archaeologist. That archaeologist is a dancer. It's a dancer in old dance. It's not what we understand by archaeologists. It's somebody who's capable of dancing in the old ways. It's an interesting kind of etymological little quirk. So some of these examples that I've given you seem unrelated to, or may seem unrelated to, the traces of the past. And yet I think that's not the case. Very frequently, that's a way you engage with the traces of the past. So in a place like Kızıldağ, for example, where we have a very layered landscape with bronze, or more likely Iron Age reliefs and these spectacular rock formations. We also have evidence in the form of not just an inscription, but a series of footprints that mention a priest called Craterus, son of Hermocrates, who danced or who jumped. The way this Craterus interacted with the reliefs was by moving in ancestral ways, in ways that he presumably had learned from his father, Hermocrates, and did so in a truly spectacular place where movement would have been dangerous unless practiced with enormous skill. I've written about this elsewhere and suggest that part of the point of moving dynamically at this space is to alter the sense of equilibrium and to commune with the gods. I mean, we know examples of this, and I don't know whether I can play it, but of course, there's a sense of this sort of break in the sense of equilibrium in Sufi dances. That in some cases will really alter the vestibular sense to the point where you can't stay upright. But cross-culturally, it's very common. Yeah, good. And so my point is, in many of these cases, the way to interact with material remains that we would call archaeological remains is in embodied fashion. This is happening in Anatolia and neighboring regions, and I'll give you another example. In Lebanon, at the monastery of Deir el-Kala in Lebanon, there are a series of inscriptions to a god called Baal Markod, and the historian of Greek and Roman dance, Frederick Nerebaut, has loosely compared the carvings on Kizilda with some of what's happening here. The epithet of Baal Markod has been understood as derived from a Semitic root associated with the domain of dance. In the mid-20th century, René Dussault accepted the etymology, but not the connection with human dance. And he suggested instead that Baal's dance is metaphorical, and that what the god moved was not his own body or the bodies of human dancers, but rather land and sea. He was a sort of god of earthquakes and tsunamis. I think there's no need to pick one god over the other. Belmarkod may be a lord of dance, both anthropological and, as it were, geohydrological. And certainly some of this is what's happening in Kizilda, when the priest dances in Kizilda. Presumably he's dancing with the lake that is a seasonal lake that appears and disappears, partly because this ritual expert knows how to move in that precarious place so that water flows. in Kizilda, we're talking about one person or maybe a small group of people. There's a handful of footprints. So let's say a few people. But dance and historical consciousness was often a community activity. And I'm going to be very brief so that we can get to the third part. But as you know, there's a lot of evidence of ritual processions along mountain roads, for example, from Phrygia to Clados or from Caria to Clados, where boys and girls are dancing eventually to get to the temple. In a more sort of reduced geographic area, there's a so-called oracle against pestilence from the town of Menie on Mount Tmolos that calls for singing and dancing to avert a plague. What's interesting about this passage is that the wording celebrates Artemis as a genetic ancestor of the Dedicans. And I think it's likely that what is happening is that the goddess is being conflated with the numen of the lake. And that the way you celebrate this connection is by singing and dancing. These issues of genetic connections with lakes or with mountains have given commentators and modern scholars a lot of trouble. Since antiquity, people were weirded out by the possibility that somebody was connected to the lake genetically or connected to a mountain genetically. Ancient scholars found the idea really bizarre. I think one of the things that's most exciting about some of this evidence is that it suggests that, in this case, the Gaugian lake may have been a participant in the Koloan's procession and not merely a destination or backdrop. That, as in the case of Kizilda or as in the case of Deir el-Kala, people are capable and interested in dancing with landscape features. I'm going to give you a little bit of textual evidence that supports this, and then we turn to my conclusions. But there's confusing and interesting textual evidence that suggests what I just said. Reeds in the lake were said in antiquity to dance during feast. Some authors express skepticism about this sort of natural cultural wonder, but others were pretty earnest about just reporting the phenomenon without qualification. Strabo talks about these dancing reeds. Others, like Varro, had visited the lake and made a sacrifice there in the 1st century BC, and he has seen sacred fish that would come up to the shore to the sound of flutes, and that nobody could cook the fish, and more importantly for us, that the islands of the Lydians could be seen dancing in the lake. There's scattered but abundant evidence of this sort of, let's say, landscape dynamism, not all of which is intended to be metaphorical, and some of which is intended to be quite literal, of people effectively dancing with landscape features. Okay, let me try to conclude briefly. So why should Anatolian archaeologists care about any of this? Varieties of historical consciousness should be a matter of importance for archaeologists interested in the relevance of our discipline, not least in countries like Turkey or Greece or Jordan, where public awareness of the existence of material traces of the past is much more intense and widespread than in places such as the US, where I work, or in my native Colombia, from where I am zooming. But it should also be of interest for archaeologists aware that our own contemporary forms of engaging with the past are peculiar. They're culturally and socially specific. They're informed and limited not just by technological capabilities and diplomatic restrictions and availability of funds, but also by our own assumptions and biases about how the past can be found in things, and also about how one is to go about making connections between those traces of the past in the present and events in former times. And this, I think, is exciting and important, and I really want to hear your opinions about this. The archaeologist Benjamin Alberti, in a very interesting review called Archaeologies of Ontology, has said ontology as a theory of reality or being exists implicitly in all archaeologically practiced in theory. Assumptions about exactly what reality is provide the ground from which to interpret the world and the past. And I think this is important and it allows for us to make perhaps dynamic connections. Anthropology in Latin America, and especially in the Amazon and the Andes, has sort of emphasized and explored fundamental alternatives of indigenous worlds. Marisol de la Cadena is one of the people who has done this, working with living interlocutors on situations where human people and mountain people do in fact coexist and interact in theory and practice. So Marisol has been able to spend some time among communities and with people who do engage with mountains as living beings. But this is part of a broader discussion in anthropology that has been, I think, very energizing for the discipline. It is associated mostly with the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, with the French anthropologist Philippe Descola, and with the Ecuadorian American anthropologist Eduardo Con. And at the heart of some of what they're saying is the possibility of taking seriously other people's worlds. In their case, those of indigenous people, but also of people other than ourselves, whoever we think we are. So taking seriously the worlds of people in the past. And this is a double maneuver, an interesting maneuver, because taking some vision seriously, say the Anatolian vision seriously, or whatever, the contemporary Amazonian community's vision seriously, necessitates also not taking seriously those assumptions that we hold dear ourselves. We must not take seriously some of the fundamental sort of basis for our discipline. And take seriously is meant in a sort of technical sense. It's not just in a mocking sense. It's just like you need to question your own ideas about what it is that archaeology is and what archaeology does. And you have to also, at the same time, try to generously and rigorously understand how it is that another person engages with a world that you yourself do not see so clearly. I think this allows for a few things. One is that it allows for comparison. Those of us working in Roman Anatolia should be able to think comparatively beyond the limits of our disciplines, beyond the traditional limits of our discipline. If one is interested in ancient dance, in ancient processions, perhaps it's worthwhile thinking about processions where people think that mountains are alive. If we want to know what the embodied dimension of one of these processions is, perhaps it's worth seeing one of them in practice, where people walk for days and days to reach a mountain or a lake. That's one of the things. Another thing that I think we should be open to is dialogue with people in the present who value traces of the past, who are not archaeologists or anthropologists or cultural heritage managers or academics at all. People who engage with, say, rock cut reliefs in ways that have their own genealogies and their own traditions. And Aytu Taşyurek did, in passing, he mentioned some very interesting ceremonies performed in the late 20th century involving rock cut reliefs. And Martin van Braunissen he hasn't written extensively about it, but he knows enormous amounts about Kurdish and other communities engaging with rock cut reliefs. I think the point about this is not because the way these people and the way the people in the past engage with these traces of the past is the same, but rather because it's not the way we do it. And in thinking about how others do it now, we may actually expand our own ideas about how to do it. But more important, I think even before having ethnographic ambitions, we need to take some of these stories in very long diachronic fashion. This is the Charonion in Antioch, a rock cut relief that is supposed to be Seleucid in Antioch, and it's another one of these mountain people, a carving of a human face on a mountain cliff, and I think that the way classicists have approached it is mostly interested in the classical past, ignoring not so much the Byzantine, but certainly medieval and Islamic and sort of later Christian engagement with these things. So we need bigger diachronic scope. Okay. And what can we as Anatolianists contribute to some of these discussions? I think there are many things, but I'm going to talk about one. Mountain people in ancient Anatolia existed for millennia. They may not exist now, but they existed for millennia. What Cornelis Bishop tried to do in capturing the Mount Tmolos, judging the musical contest, has been done over and over and over again in Anatolia. These are examples of representations of mountain people under very different cultural settings. What we have here is enormous time depth about ontological clashes between, in some cases, people who actually engage with mountain people and others who do not. I mentioned the Charonion. This is a late Hellenistic or Roman altar of Mount Tmolos. It's actually the basis on which Greeny drew his mosaic, and it shows some of the contradictions and complexities of what is a mountain person. Here, it's kind of emerging from the rock, but it's also kind of a baby in its suppleness and kind of fattiness. But there it is, the rock and the human. Many of you will know this better than I do. Mount Argaios, the representation of Mount Argaios is constantly sort of ambivalent and complicated because it's unclear whether it should be a mountain or a person, and you get these coins like this 2nd century coin of Lucius Verus, where you just get everything at the same time, a mountain and its power and a person. We have thousands of years of this in Anatolia. This is a medieval manuscript, 10th, 11th century manuscript of the poet Nicander from Colophon. And the figure on the right is again Tmolos being portrayed as a person and a mountain and a complicated figure that kind of emerges from the rock. And another example yet that I've written about in my book is Saint Ariadne of Prymnesus in Phrygia, here escaping an intolerant Roman by being steadfast in her faith and merging with a mountain. So I think one of the things we can contribute as an Anatolianist is greater time depth and greater specificity about what ontological clashes of this sort were like, not just in the Hittite period, but also in the Roman period and in later periods, about people who engage with the traces of the past in different ways because they have different forms of historical consciousness. So thank you very much.